hello everyone. Good afternoon from Oxford, or good morning, good evening, depending when you're calling in from today. Thank you for joining us for the 8th webinar session of the Engaging with Evidence series. My name is Laura Bonsever. I'm Communications and Engagement Officer at the Government Outcomes Lab based here at the University of Oxford, and I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting today's session with my colleague Tanya Hamid. For today's session, we'll be drawing on hot off the press research by the Government Outcomes Lab, and we'll be sparking an engaging discussion with our guest panelists on how outcomes-based contracting can be used to provide more effective social services in complex and fragmented ecosystems of support. We'll be looking at examples in the UK and around the world of partnerships driving social change by rallying together organisations around a shared set of outcomes to help those with complex needs, such as people facing barriers living independently. As always, we'll be drawing on academic research, but also looking at practical considerations for policymakers and practitioners working on the ground. So, to briefly introduce ourselves, for those who might not be familiar with the Government Outcomes Lab or our series, we are a small research and policy centre based here at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. We do research around the evidence and the use of outcomes-based contracting and cross-sector partnerships. So we look at innovative financing models such as social impact bonds and outcomes funds. Beyond our research, we also have a multifaceted programme of engagement and capacity building to ensure the insights that we and others around the world produce are made accessible and can be used in policy and in practice. That is why we launched our Engaging with Evidence series. So we launched this back in January. It is a platform for policymakers, for practitioners, for academics to all come together from around the world and engage in the latest findings in the field. We've got some really fantastic sessions coming up, especially one in December, where we'll be drawing on research from the Government Outcomes Lab and on the Sorbonne Business School in Paris to explore the role of cross-sector partnerships and innovative financing tools in supporting refugees. We'll be announcing the date very shortly, so do sign up to our monthly newsletter to receive all of the latest updates on our upcoming events. Coming back to today's session, we're going to follow a similar structure to other sessions, so starting with a presentation and followed by a panel discussion. For the presentation, we'll be hearing from GoLab researchers, Dr. AlNur Carter and Franziska Rosenbach, who will be discussing key insights from their recently published interim report on the Kirklees Integrated Support Service and Better Outcomes Partnership. For the second part of the session, my colleague Tanya Hamid will be moderating a discussion with our wonderful panel of guest speakers. We'll be hearing from AlNur Ibrahim, Professor of Management at Tufts University, Richard Johnson, Senior Advisor at the Global Fund and Senior Consultant for the World Bank, Sarah Cook, Managing Director of the Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership, and Val Keane, Head of the UK's Government Changing Futures Programme in the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. Before we hear from the speakers, it would be really great to hear who is joining us today online. So do feel free to say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're joining in from today. It really is always so great to hear people coming from across sectors, but also right across the world. So we do like to also keep our sessions interactive. So do feel free to use the chat at any point to ask questions, to leave any reflections, to connect with others. People have really enjoyed the networking element in the past, so do please make use of that if you'd like. Final thing is we love to see everyone's faces, so do keep your camera on if you can, no worries if not, but do remember to stay muted while others are speaking. Final note is we also will be recording this session. We'll be posting the recording of the session after this on our YouTube channel and on our website. So you'll also find the slides as well, which we have actually already on the website and we can post in the chat. With no further ado, I'd like to then pass on to Al and Franziska. So if you don't mind first introducing yourselves, that would be wonderful. So over to you. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. My name is AlNur Carter. I'm Research Director for the Government Outcomes Lab. I'll pass to Franziska to introduce.
Hi everyone, I'm Franziska and I'm a research associate at the GoLab, and I've been mainly working together with Elle in getting our report on the Kirklees integrated services. So.
Great. So I'll kick off. I'm really thrilled to be sharing the findings of this first stage of our research. I'll begin by providing some of the background and the key concepts, and then Franziska will describe the detailed research approach and findings, and then we'll also give a little taster for the next stage of our research. So there are many different places that we could begin with the story of this research project. We could start with the challenge of fragmentation. So public service fragmentation is quite a difficult concept to visualise, but this image shows the landscape of public service delivery at a local level in the UK. So you see a huge range and scope of services provided and funded by different organisations. And in some ways, this is a fantastic and vibrant landscape with people accessing the services needed. But there are also issues with this picture. It's simultaneously congested and fractured. So particularly for people who are facing severe and multiple disadvantage, this brings challenges. You might interact superficially with numerous different parts of the landscape at the same time, while social outcomes remain persistently poor. So a person who takes drugs to deal with childhood trauma, who falls into offending as a consequence, and who loses their home when entering prison, acquires 3 different labels. And each one of these parts of the system responds differently, discreetly. So different parts of the statutory and voluntary systems are not talking to one another. This fragmentation was something that we saw in our research in Kirklees. So for example, back in 2017, the council was managing 27 different individual provider contracts in relation to one floating support service. I'll leave Sarah Cook, the director for Kbop, to really centre the experience of people in Kirklees who participate in services. But in short, a person-centred provision now requires real coordination or integration of a range of different support spanning multi-sector, multi-organisational ecosystem. So this is the challenge against which this research is set. On the next slide is another place where we could start. So this is our research questions and ambition. At the Go Lab, our aim is to grow the understanding of outcomes-based contracting and commissioning. And in partnership with the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, our aim is to evaluate impact bonds as a contracting and commissioning tool. So I often use the analogy of a jam donut here to describe the evaluation challenge, because so much policy evaluation work centres on evaluating a very specific frontline intervention or service. So this is the sticky jam. But here the focus of the evaluation is actually on the commissioning and contracting structure. So we really aim to investigate the ways in which organisations are funded and held to account. So this is the doughy scaffolding of funding and contracts. Increasingly, there's an acknowledgement that the mode of coordination and accountability, so the dough, has very real implications for the substance and the quality of services. And if we care about improving services, then we need to ask, did the social impact bond make a difference to the outcomes achieved when compared to alternative commissioning approaches? And this is enormously difficult to research because it's so rare that a service is commissioned using multiple different contracting approaches. And one supporting research question that I should mention also comes from an observation that impact bonds are no one thing. So we have seen this combination of an outcomes contract and independent third-party investors, the kind of key ingredients of a SIB, used to respond to a range of different public service challenges. And we acknowledge that impact bonds as mechanisms for affecting change might look very different from place to place and from contract to contract. So our research also brings a focus on the mechanism of change. So the Kirklees project, Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership, is a particularly exciting research partner because there is a similar service that exists before the introduction of the impact bond, and we can follow its development under this new contracting arrangement. So this slide is another place where the story of the research could begin. So this is a description of the service and the outcomes. So this is a service for vulnerable adults who are understood to need support to live independently. Kirklees Council is a local authority in Northern England, and since the 2000s has been delivering a flexible package of floating support services to help people sustain independent living. So along the bottom of this slide, you'll see the 9 main charitable delivery organisations that have been involved in this service for a long time. So this is the contracting arrangement before the initiation of the social impact bond. So up until 2019, the council managed a range of bilateral fee-for-service contracts with these service providers. This is the era that we focus on in the first stage of our research. This is life before the SIB. And what follows on the next slide in September 2019, you'll see the introduction of an outcomes contract and the involvement of a social investor. So this slide is the new configuration where DCMS, central government, provides a top-up contribution for outcome payments. Kirklees Council remains the commissioner, it's the main outcomes payer, which holds an outcomes contract with a new organisation. This is Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership, or Kbop, with a new team established by the Social Investment Fund Managers, Bridges Fund Management. So Kbop is a sort of social prime contract holder, which then holds service delivery contracts and provides performance management and support to the original network of service providers. So if we were to understand the implications of this SIB arrangement, it's really important that we have a good understanding of the alternative non-SIB contracting arrangements. And this was the first phase of research back in 2019, which Franziska will describe now.
Thank you, Elle. So what I want to do now is give you an overview on the methods, findings from the first phase of our research, and map out some initial hypotheses how the SIB can facilitate more effective service provision. So the purpose of the first research phase was to gain an in-depth understanding of the fee-for-service contract, which serves, as Elle has mentioned, as a comparator to the current SIB contracting model. In order to track the changes associated with the two contracting mechanisms, we use a process evaluation. The first phase of the process evaluation consisted in particular of a series of in-depth interviews with key people from the council, provider and referral organization, as well as with the responsible investment fund manager. The purpose of these interviews was to gain different perspectives on managing and delivering a fee-for-service contract. Moreover, we conducted logic model workshops with frontline staff to map out how the fee-for-service intervention was meant to produce the different outcomes for service users. The documentary analysis of the fee-for-service contracts enabled us to gain an understanding of the key performance indicators and the contractual levers in case the service was underperforming. Finally, we are also conducting a longitudinal survey for frontline staff. The purpose of this survey is to be able to track if and how managerial practice is shaped by the different contracting arrangement. The first wave was launched prior to the rollout of the SIB, and we just launched the second wave literally today. So next slide, please. Turning to the findings, we identified 4 main challenges related to the fee-for-service contract. Challenge number 1 was a limited practice of market stewardship. Public service commissioners are expected to create the conditions for an effective market of providers. However, during the fee-for-service regime, the council engaged in a limited practice of market stewardship. This included a lack of competitive pressure, limited transparency on the demand for and performance of services, and an uncertainty over funding, diverting providers' attention from service provision. The SIB might enable an enhanced practice of market stewardship, including increased constructive performance competition, a central intelligence system to record performance and service demand, and a stable long-term contracting environment. Challenge number 2 was a limited contract and performance management. This was driven by capacity limits with resource-constrained staff responsible for managing many bilateral contracts. In addition, limited contractual levers provided perverse incentives or lacked clear, well-defined measures of success. For instance, providers were benchmarked against hitting utilization targets where there was no external verification on the intervention outcome independent living. The SIP might facilitate enhanced performance management with contracts managed through a single external entity and payment tied to the achievement of sustainable outcomes. Challenge number 3 was a limited flexibility in the delivery of services. Providers often require flexibility in order to meet the needs of individual service users. However, the fee-for-service contract imposed tight specifications on service intensity and length. This ultimately limited the likely effectiveness of the intervention, especially for harder to engage service users. The SIP may bring enhanced flexibility in service delivery with autonomy for providers in service design and an adaptive approach to management by the social prime, Kbop. The final fourth challenge identified was a limited collaboration across provider organizations. Supporting service users with multiple complex needs often requires collaboration between different service providers. Under the fee-for-service contracts, service users were expected to be enrolled with only one provider at any one time. This meant that the infrastructure for collaborative working was underdeveloped with a lack of formal procedures for co-working. In addition, the requirement to evidence demand for individual services fueled competition for referrals between providers, further inhibiting collaboration. The SIP might enable enhanced collaboration between providers with improved information sharing and co-working towards a shared interest in achieving outcomes.
Thank you. So I think what's really striking is how much of the challenge sits well beyond the contract. And we really need to acknowledge that the operating environment here is shaped by the long shadow of austerity. So these challenges of ambiguous referral pathways, potential revolving door issues between different agencies, constrained capacity on the part of the council, and indeed in other parts of the public sector, particularly around mental health provision, is really challenging. So this is an outcomes contract, not a superhero. And I think we need to really question how much it is reasonable to load these promises and expectations onto the social impact bond. What's particularly important for our future research is to note that Kbop is quite different to the mainstream model of a SIB, where an evaluative payment mechanism wraps around a single provider and a single service. So we hope to reveal more on this in the next phase of our research. So we've just started the next stage of primary work with Sarah, Richard, Emma Hanley, who's the lead commissioner, and some others on the line. So thank you for your support for the research. But in this second stage, we aim to explore the ability of Kbop and the SIB mechanism to respond to challenges at 2 levels. So at the frontline level, we will look to understand practice change in interactions between staff and participants. So are services more flexible and responsive under the SIB arrangements? But we've also planned methods to try and explore the extent to which Kbop is shaping the wider system. So thinking about the number and type of services that are available and how these connect to one another. And this is really where I think there's a great connection to some of Professor AlNur Ibrahim's work, because the strategic challenge for Kbop is really in how to integrate or coordinate the constellation of activities and actors that produce collective outcomes. So this research presentation is maybe more of a setting the scene than providing the answers, but stay tuned because it's certainly an exciting one to follow over the years to come. And for today, I'm really excited to get into a conversation about the implications of outcomes contracting as a tool to counteract service fragmentation and potentially enabling a sort of a supportive ecosystem coordination function within an outcomes contracting container. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franziska, for that insightful presentation. And I really do encourage everyone to give the report a read. You'll find it both on our website and at gov.uk. We just have a couple minutes, so if anyone would like to raise their hand or ask any questions in the chat, do feel free to do so. Don't see any questions so far, but just to give everyone some time, Elle, I was wondering if I could come to you with a question around your research. Could you let us know or tell us a bit more about the process and the challenges in conducting this research, and if you have any plans to look at payment by results contracts in slightly different contexts, either geographically or in other policy areas?
Thanks, Laura. I think this is something that we're really growing an appreciation for. The more projects and impact bonds and outcomes contracts we look at, the more varied beasts they seem to be, and they're responding to very different challenges in each instance. So I think we're still on the learning path to get better at by which we expect these tools to work. So some of the basics you'll see on the Indigo dataset that we host online, but certainly this is something that we'll be focusing on more in future research. So we have other projects that look at very different impact bond projects, one around mental health and employment partnerships, which has a far more stable and singular frontline intervention. And the challenge is really to do a good job of performance managing a service. I think what's curious about Kirklees is it's so loose and flexible in terms of what that service looks like. And the challenge is not necessarily getting one service right, but in coordinating across a whole system. This is something that government seems to really struggle to buy. And certainly in the UK, there's been experience of using different types of outcomes contracts for employment support in particular. We've seen a lot of evolution in the ways in which government buys services to help people move back into work. And real questions, I think, as to whether those contracts have done as well as they might have done in terms of integrating, connecting different bits of the public sector to different support in order to improve outcomes. So we're still learning how to do all of this stuff, I think.
Thanks very much, Elle. We've got a couple of questions coming in the chat. So Rob asked a question about ecosystems. Rob, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question to the audience?
Thanks, Laura. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just I was interested in the term ecosystem and why it's being used. What is it kind of based on? Does it really mean anything? And I put it rather bluntly in the chat, as in, doesn't it maybe just sound like a very nice sounding metaphor? Is there anything more than this here? Because Elle, you also mentioned landscape, constellation, and I just wondered, are these nice metaphors or is there something else going on?
Thanks, Rob. I think we're still settling into what exactly it is. So I think maybe that's why we're a bit fluid in the terminology that we use. In the past, I've talked about this as a network, which I think maybe gives more static sense of this. And I think the benefit of drawing on the language of ecosystems, which I think is far more common in business research actually than in social policy research, is you get the sense of animation and liveliness. This is a living entity. So I think there's some of that comes through, but it also very crudely borrows the language from AlNur's book, which talks about ecosystems. And I think the way in which AlNur uses this expression, it just really brings to life the multifaceted, kind of bubbly, lively, but often disconnected world of different bits of service provision. So I suppose it's some of that liveliness that we're trying to get at. But Rob, I'd be interested to talk more about this. And if we haven't got the language quite right, then something for us to work on too.
Thanks very much, Rob. I think we had James in the chat also had a question. Would you like to unmute yourself, James?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And I perhaps don't understand everything about the Kirklees project. So just a clarification question, really. I was just reflecting on, Elle, how you introduced this about working in complex systems. And I was thinking, and the use of financial incentives to try and overcome some of that. And I was thinking about some work we've done in adoption services where a similar problem exists, that the problem with local authority adoption services is they were financially incentivized to work within their area, which kind of prevented collaboration. So one of the solutions is you change that incentive, so you actually incentivize to work at a regional level, which is half successful, but you still have the problem that people are incentivized to work within a set boundary and not beyond that. And that's still creating issues. And I wondered whether the same risk sits here, that you introduce the complex system at the beginning of 45, 50 different services. And then the Kirklees project is almost drawing a circle around 7 of those. I think it was 7. And you're almost saying, well, we therefore change incentives and this can incentivize collaboration, but you're still drawing a circle around not the whole system, but only 7 organizations within that. So isn't there a risk that some of the problem is overcome, but not the whole thing. And there's an incentive actually for those organizations to work with each other at the expense of perhaps working with organizations that sit outside of that structure.
Should I have a go at answering that? Yeah, so I think that's a very good point, that some organizations are sort of closer to the core here than others, but I'll be interested in Sarah's response to this one as well, because I think there's different parts of the coordination challenge here. One part is around coordination between the very close-knit group of service provider organizations, but there's also challenge at the intersection with other bits of the public sector. So what does the interaction look like between the mental health provision in Kirklees and the baton passing between these service provider charities and different bits of the health system, or be that probation or social housing? So there is a sense of the team here needing to smooth and join up with organizations beyond this core network of provider organizations. So I think maybe this is something that we also need to take through into the next stage of research, is coordination multiply. There's a sense of a team of different service offers that needs to be cohered, but there's also this far wider set of interactions with this wider system or ecosystem, and that seems to be a big part of the challenge as well. And I imagine that Val has comments on this from her work too, where you've got some organizations that are more closely managed under a particular contract, but that doesn't take away from your need to work well with wider partners.
Val, feel free to chip in if you'd like. I can see you nodding.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'll be really interested to see how that element of it shapes up as the research continues. I think, I mean, thinking about those kind of 7 organisations offering separate services in a way that wasn't very coordinated from what your research has found so far, each one of those 7 would have been trying to manage its relationships with all of the other bits of the system, which sounds like that could create quite a messy picture. And it seems like there is at least scope with this arrangement for more of a focal point for the management of those relationships and the reaching of agreements on different ways of working that can better meet people's needs. So maybe to the kind of coordination point, it takes out a level of complexity and kind of raises it to a body that has more of an opportunity to deliver that coordination effectively.
Thanks very much, Val. I think that might be coming from Chris, who I was just about to go to for.
Yeah, one of the one of the observations with the Kirklees model, it can look like it's just moved the commissioning down a level, you know, from the authority to another body. If that body is quite thin, you don't actually add a great deal. It's obviously helpful if you're all talking together under a single head. But my question would be, where's the customer within that model? Because, you know, your fragmentation chart at the beginning was an amazing, lovely chart showing the view of the world from the person needing help, which is very complex, and also different shades of grey in terms of intensity of effort with some organisations and less with some others. I think key to the middle of this is how you work with the person that needs help. Within the Changing Futures programme, we talked about the trusted person model, for example, and I don't see that within the framework. I think that's critical, it seems to me, for how you work together to help someone make the most of their life chances through any kind of progress, whether it's housing or addiction or sustained living or whatever it may be. I think that would be a helpful thing. And a question, if I may, from having looked at this quite a few times, the funding partner is nearly always either central government or some big organisation.
So it would be nice to try and implement some of these things, but it seems to be you have to start with a big organization noticing you or a central government department noticing you. And that's kind of tough, you know, at the ground level. And I think that I think needs to be resolved in some way, so that actually we can instigate these from the ground where we want to happen, rather than wait to be noticed by a big organization. So some comment on, you know, the sources of funding from social investors and government would be helpful. Can that be brought down to a lower level, a more local level?
Ella, Francisca, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, just to Chris' comment, thank you very much for this helpful comment. And I just wanted to flag, so it's kind of still early stages. We are now 2 years into delivery with Kbop, but there was also COVID in between. And in terms of your question, where does the customer sit? Maybe I want to bring in Sarah here, because they are in very early stages now, launching some co-production work. So Sarah, I don't know if you want to come in here.
Yeah, happy to. So I think it's a really important point that Chris has made, and I think to reassure the participant sits at the centre of everything that we do. So in terms of these contracts, we are ultimately accountable to the people that we are working alongside, and everything we do is led by them, created by them, designed by them. The reasons these programs work is because the outcomes metrics gives us the flexibility to be person-led and to respond to whatever they need. So when you think about it with the wider issues with the ecosystem, say, our first question to all individuals we work with is, what do you want to do? What do you want to achieve? And how can we get you there? And then it is our role as Kbop to facilitate that through the individuals that we're working with, through the providers that we're working with, through our community that we work within, through the statutory bodies and through the health bodies. And we bring everyone together as part of that. And Francesca's right, we've got a co-production group that leads everything we do within it, from our referral development, our leaflet development, who we have the conversation with, where they're finding the biggest challenges in the community, where they want us to advocate on their behalf as their voice across the wider organisations. And then again, with the different partners, we are responsible for leading them on that commissioning basis. But again, they are accountable to the individuals that we work with. So everything we do in terms of that contract management process holds them to account on behalf of the people that we're delivering the service for. So I think the people that we work alongside are at the centre of everything. They lead everything, and these contracts give us the ability to respond to that in place of having to work alongside quite a rigid specification where we would have to work and respond to the specification rather than to the needs of the individual.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and Chris also for posing the question. Richard Johnson, as chair of Kbop, do you have anything you'd like to add? I know that you've been quite active in the chat responding to a few of the questions people have started to have.
I would just qualify the observation that Chris made about how the commissioning had been moved down a level. In some ways, the commissioning had been contracted out, but along with it being contracted out, payments were attached to outcomes. And that is absolutely key, because you can't do the same thing. You can't attach an incentive in the same way as long as it sits within a public sector body. You can only attach that incentive when you take it out of that public sector system and contract it out in this way. So the money is attached to the outcomes. And then in order to achieve those outcomes for as many people as possible, the only way to do it, as Sarah has found in Kirklees, is to personalize your service. Because unless you're listening to the individual, you're not going to enable them to achieve the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. Yeah, thank you everyone for posing these questions. We have now a really rich discussion planned. This has been a wonderful warm-up for that. So for the next part of the discussion, I'll hand over to Tanya now for the panel discussion. So thank you, Elle and Franzi again, and for our speakers. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Laura, and thanks, Elle and Francisca, for that great presentation. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for the session. My name is Tanya Hamid, and I'm a Research and Policy Associate at the Government Outcomes Lab. It's great to be here with you today and to be with our lovely panel who we'll be joined by in just a second. I'm really excited for this next part of the session, where we'll be focusing on the role of outcomes contracting and cross-sector collaborations, particularly when it comes to addressing service fragmentation. And so today we're lucky to have with us academics as well as practitioners from a range of sectors and international experiences who will build on the findings that Ellen Francisca just very helpfully shared. And so the discussion is going to be based on three main themes. So firstly, we'll be looking at the role of ecosystem orchestrators, particularly when it comes to fostering cross-sector collaboration. So he'll be picking up on Professor AlNur Brahim's research and bringing that into the discussion. Secondly, we will be looking at the use of outcomes-based contracting, particularly when it comes to responding to service fragmentations. We've already talked a bit about Kirklees. We'll be going into a bit more detail, bringing in insights from Sarah, but also more international insights from Richard. And then finally, we'll be bringing in some more practical considerations for policymakers and practitioners from Keane and from Richard as well. And so in this time, please do keep dropping in any questions or comments that you have into the chat, and we'll be stopping from time to time and bringing these into the discussion. And so before we delve into the meat of the discussion, I'd like to come to our panelists one by one. And I wonder if you could please introduce yourselves and in particular the perspective that you're bringing to the discussion today. We're going to go in alphabetical order. So we're going to start with Professor AlNur, then go on to Richard, Sarah, and then Wow. So if you could just keep it to a minute or so each so that we can then get into the discussion. So starting with you, Professor AlNur.
Thank you so much, Tanya and the Go Lab for the invitation. Really, really delighted to be with you all on this topic. My name is AlNur. I'm on the faculty at the Fletcher School, which is a School of International Affairs, and the Tisch College, which is a School of Civic Engagement, both at Tufts University. My work focuses on the challenges of performance and strategy in social change organizations. So those can be nonprofits or for-profits, and in some instances, I look at governmental agencies as well. And so the book that Elle kindly mentioned is called Measuring Social Change with Stanford University Press, which really looks at 4 different kinds of strategies for social change, of which an ecosystem strategy is one. And I'll say a bit more about that in a couple of minutes. But it's really just one strategic option to deal with very, very complex multi-actor challenges. The other part of work that I'm working on is governance, how you actually design governance structures in complex ecosystem level problem solving to have a governance body that's actually able to provide direction and guidance on that. So thank you for the invitation, delighted to be here.
Hi, Richard Johnson. I've been working on outcomes contracts, outcomes-based services for over 20 years now. I have chaired 4 SIBs that are now closed. I'm currently chairing 5 in the UK, and I have a youth employment DIB in Palestine as well. Most of my time, however, I'm a consultant or an advisor for the World Bank and the Global Fund, advising on how to use contracting and performance management in order to increase your service impact. And a little bit later, I'd like to give you a couple of examples. They're not impact bonds, but I think more generally around performance-based contracting in fragile contexts. And I'll give you an example from Afghanistan's health service contracting and also in Nigeria around malaria testing and treatment. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cook. I'm the Managing Director for Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership. Having worked in the third sector for about 20 years now, I've both delivered and led contracts across housing, homelessness and justice services within grant-based supporting people and charity programs. And through this learning and frustrations across all these different programs, this has given me my passion about social outcomes contracts. I'm currently leading the Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership in West Yorkshire, and previously led the GM Homes Partnership in Greater Manchester, which was a rough sleepers social outcomes contract designed in collaboration with Andy Burnham as part of his commitment to end rough sleeping, which had extraordinary results for more than 200 individuals, enabling them to access and sustain their own homes after anything up to 20 years of service exclusion and sleeping on the streets.
Hi everyone, I'm Val Keane, really nice to be here and yeah, delighted to join the discussion. I'm currently heading up the Changing Futures programme based at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Been doing that since March. And Changing Futures is aiming to improve services and systems to better support people facing multiple disadvantage. It's not being delivered on the basis of outcomes contracts. It has a strong outcomes focus, and it's got a very strong focus on kind of a systems approach to driving change, as well as thinking about the frontline interventions. Previously, I used to lead the Centre for Social Impact Bonds at DCMS, and I've also delivered a couple of social impact bonds as part of when I used to work for a charity, and also managed some of MHCLG's SIB programs. So lots of background to working with SIBs from different perspectives. And then, like Sarah, also lots of previous history working in kind of more conventional contracting. So have seen kind of pros and cons of both of those, and can definitely identify with some of that long-standing frustration.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. It's so wonderful to have such a wealth of experience with us today from not only different sectors, but also different countries. And so to begin with, I'd like to come to you, Professor AlNur, and in your recent book, which has already been mentioned, Measuring Social Change, you talk about 4 social change strategies, of which the ecosystem strategy is particularly relevant to today's discussion, especially when it comes to coordinating and fostering some of these cross-sector collaborations. So for our audience's benefit, could you perhaps introduce this concept of ecosystem orchestrators? So what are they and why are they required?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Tanya. And this goes directly to Rob McMillan's question about why the ecosystem metaphor. So if we take, just as a starting point, the standard kind of dictionary definitions, right? And I'm going to talk about both, I'm going to differentiate between a niche and an ecosystem strategy, which are 2 of the 4 strategies that I talk about in my book. So if you take the Oxford Dictionary definition of a niche strategy, it is a role taken by a type of organism within its community. And if we replace organism with organization, we have a role taken by an organization within its community. And we see that in that fragmented picture that Elle set up in her presentation, you have different organizations playing very specific service provider roles within a community. But there isn't necessarily the coherence within that community, the interaction that you might want to have to solve the problem. So an ecosystem, again, if we take a dictionary definition, is a complex community of organisms and its environment functioning as an ecological unit. And it's that second part, functioning as some sort of a unit where there's real interactions across in order to serve something that's bigger than the individual parts, that becomes really critical here. Now, this is not to say that niche strategic interventions are bad. I think there's a place for them. So imagine, for example, that you need to call an ambulance for a medical emergency. The ambulance will pick you up, administer emergency response, and drop you off at the hospital. What they've done within an ecosystem is they are a niche service provider, and they've handed you off to the next service provider in the chain. And so they are actually functioning as part of an ecosystem. But now imagine a circumstance where the system is not really working very effectively. So ambulances are not able to take you to the hospital. There just aren't enough hospitals, or the services at the hospitals are terrible. Imagine a context where you've got an organization providing warm meals to the homeless, which is an essential emergency service, but it doesn't get people out of homelessness. And there's no connection to those other parts of the puzzle. So that's where we actually need, where there isn't a functioning system, a new way of thinking about what might a functioning system look like. And that's where I think the ecosystem metaphor comes in quite handy. So to your question, Rob, I think the challenge here is reconfiguring all of the players within the system in order to produce better results. This is not simply coordinating between existing relationships. It's fundamentally changing some of those relationships between players, how they interact in order to generate a set of interdependent outcomes. So the comment that Richard made earlier about, the outcomes being really critical here, if we're going to deliver on those, we need some constellation, to use that term again, of actors that are going to be able to deliver on that. And so we need to set boundaries around it because we simply don't have the capacity to involve all players. But we need to have some basis for identifying who are the critical sets of actors that play an important role in delivering on a shared outcome. So I lay out 4 different ingredients of an ecosystem strategy. So let me take each in turn and spend really just about 30 seconds on each one. I'll keep my remarks brief so that we have time to come back to maybe some examples as we go through this. So there's 4 ingredients. The first is a system framing. The second is an interdependent model of social change. The third is accountability for collective outcomes. And the fourth is new capacities, what I call capacities for orchestration. Let me take each in turn. So the first is a system framing. So we need to understand for any organization, its current role within the existing fragmented system. So I asked this question to an organization called Miriam's Kitchen in Washington, DC, which works on homeless services provision. They identified over 100 organizations just in the Washington, DC area working on some aspect of the homelessness problem. So that's that fragmented system. And they set a boundary around it, which was a geographic boundary, the Washington, DC area. And within that, there were these 100 organizations. But trying to understand who's doing what are the interrelationships, and could something better be done by not just coordinating, but restructuring the actual nature of the relationships among them. But really understanding that system, framing it, actually mapping it out is the first step. The second step is, okay, so what does this mean for a model of social change? Can we develop a theory of change that's interdependent among many of these players? It turns out that in homelessness, there is such a model. Within the US, we call it housing first, or permanent supportive housing, which shows that if you center the client, center the person, this is Chris's question, if you center the person, what is the constellation of services that can be wrapped around them in order to address the problem? So here we're looking at services around food, shelter, both transitional as well as long-term housing, job training, substance abuse treatment, mental health counseling, financial assistance, and so on. And different individuals will need different services. But is there a model that works for all of that? And the permanent supportive housing model suggests that if you put people in housing first and then wrap around customized services, you actually have a model that reduces recidivism, people going back into homelessness, quite effectively. And there's real data around that. So that's the second feature, the interdependent social change model. The third is accountability for those collective outcomes. Can you identify 1 or 2, or at the most 3, but preferably 1 outcome that everybody is rowing towards? And in this case, the work that I've done with Miriam's Kitchen, it's around reducing chronic homelessness, so repeated episodes of homelessness. It turns out getting people to agree on that outcome turns out not to be so hard. Even measuring it is not hard. The hard part is aligning the work around it. That's the strategy. That's the strategic work. Getting everybody to do their bit in a way that actually leads to that outcome. The fourth and final piece is this capacity for orchestration. So notice that the skills required here are not only in the delivery of individual services, but it's skills for organizing that group of actors. It's skills for joint advocacy, to lobby for additional resources for housing, for instance, to influence city budgets at a time when it's essential to influence them. And so the need for advocacy capacity and social mobilization and organizing capacity turns out to be really critical here. And this was a lesson that Miriam's Kitchen with its partners needed to develop. And certainly it very much sounds like what the Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership does. Another language for this that's been developed by a consultancy firm, FSG, is they call it backbone organizations. So you might have one backbone like Kbop, or you might have multiple backbones. And I found with my work with Miriam's Kitchen, there's 3 types of backbones. One is a local community backbone, which is partnerships among local organizations trying to coordinate their own work. Then there's a policy backbone, which influences national policy so that you actually get the right kinds of commissioning and support. Within the US context, there's national advocacy organizations, as well as governmental agencies like the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Veterans Affairs. And then there's an evidence backbone, which is again, typically national organizations that work with Miriam's Kitchen and others to actually collect data that help them monitor the outcomes. And so a key organization around this is called Community Solutions within the US. So 3 backbones in this instance. But again, the 4 ingredients of the ecosystem strategy are that system framing, the interdependent social change model, the accountability for collective outcomes, and these new capacities for orchestration. I think impact bonds provide one mechanism, but there may indeed be other mechanisms for putting in place these 4 key ingredients of an ecosystem strategy. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for explaining that so clearly and comprehensively, Professor AlNur. Lots to unpack there, so I'll definitely be circling back to some more of those examples and those ingredients that you mentioned. But before we do that, I wanted to pivot slightly to the use of outcomes-based partnerships, particularly the role in responding to service fragmentation. So if I could turn to you next, Sarah, given the instrumental role that you continue to play in the Kirklees project, it would be great to bring in your perspective a bit more. And in particular, what are the challenges that you were hoping to respond to in Kirklees? And how do you think outcomes-based contracting can be used to address some of these challenges? And is there anything special about this as a commissioning tool?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's so much behind it, really, isn't there, with part of this? And I think in terms of what we do as Kbop and how we have tried to act as the ecosystem orchestrator, I think that there are some key objectives that we implemented straight away and what we wanted to do. So our main priorities when delivering this are ensuring the collaboration, creating relationships, always responding to the individuals that we work alongside, using data-led decision-making to inform everything that we do to improve the service, identify the barriers and identify solutions behind them, challenging the systems through a collective voice, which I think is a huge part of us working together as that collaboration, that alliance, and then underpinning all of that with innovation. We try to identify what doesn't work, but rather than just doing that, we try and find new ways around it and new ways of operating. Our ambition, has always been to change the system and not the person. So we do this by working together across Kirklees to challenge individual organisations, to challenge the service fragmentation. That means that, unfortunately, organisations are acting against each other as a result of their specific contract mechanisms or funding objectives, which prevent the needs of the individual being at the forefront of delivery. We want to bring the system together so it's person-centred and everything is led by the individual at the heart of it. I think some of the challenges that we experienced straight away, as identified in the report that Ellen and Francesca were discussing, was that the multiple organisations that we lead were working against each other. They were all almost fighting to work with the same group of individuals who were trapped at the centre of the support process. Each organisation is an expert in their own field, but the individuals we work with felt like they were being passed between providers who were often only able to address the presenting problem or part of the issue, rather than having the time and the experience to be able to understand what the cause was behind that presenting issue and what needed to be done to prevent the cycle of somebody being re-referred into services. The 4 key areas mentioned around the limited market stewardship, the limited performance management, limited flexibility, and the limited collaboration were the 4 key areas that we then implemented alternatives to around what we did as Kbop. And the social outcomes mechanisms behind that gave us the tools and the opportunities to respond to each of those. And as I've mentioned, put the individual back at the centre of everything. The social outcomes contracting means we could address each area and introduce accountability, flexibility and innovation in everything that we did. And again, to pick up on Chris's point, our shared vision that we implemented to overcome the barrier is fundamentally, we must be accountable to the person receiving the service. Every decision we make, every contract approach we use by Kbop, by our delivery partners, by our community, or by our fellow system orchestrators means that they have to be accountable to the person that we are working alongside. And from the beginning, we used really careful consultation with commissioners, with delivery organisations, with participants, with staff delivering the services, so that the outcomes mechanisms meant that we could use those priorities to change that approach to support and delivery. To pick up on each point, in terms of the limited market stewardship, what we did is we introduced increased competition and quality standards by setting up a new quality approach and values across all providers. We contract manage them very carefully, but very collaboratively, implementing new training, a new quality audit process, shared data system, single data recording processes, and standardized methods of support across all partners. And one of the biggest things that we did here was introduce the new asset-based model. Previous support had been very deficit-based. Everything was around what's wrong with a person, what a person can't do, what a person had failed to do previously in their life, and what had caused the issues with homelessness. But with our approach, we flipped this. We use a trauma-informed response to understand what somebody wants to achieve and how we can get them there. And we made sure that we moved individuals and services away from focusing on numbers and focusing back on the person. The new contract with a 5-year stewardship behind it gave them the chance to implement this on an entirely organisational basis. So again, they could get to the cause of what was happening, and their organisations could support that rather than your standard 2-year rolling programmes where people have only just mobilised and then you're entering decommissioning phases again. And a great example of this is Horton, which is one of our partners who have now implemented the asset-based approach throughout their entire organisation. So rather than just Kbop delivering in this strength-based way, their entire organisation is, which is a further 6 supported housing schemes and wider services, which is an example of how our market stewardship has now implemented the systems change across the Kirklees. I think when we look at the limited performance management element, again, we introduce a clear and detailed performance management metrics. We've got specific KPIs and deliverables, as Richard mentioned, around the outcomes that we want each partner to achieve, but they're adapted in response to the individual partner's specialisms. It's not 8 organisations all trying to do the same thing. It's 8 organisations trying to use their expertise and work in the best way with the individuals they're supporting. So, for example, an individual fleeing domestic abuse doesn't have to work with 3 different organisations. They work with our domestic abuse provider to manage the safety, whilst being supported by a housing provider and a substance misuse provider, so that the expertise from each area is part of a single programme of support. Our contract management process is very directive, but very supportive, and we operate in a very clear approach through trust, honesty, and relationships. It's very much one of no surprises and collaboration. Our role as Kbop is to help and support our partners. And if something's failing contractually, then it's Kbop's role to understand why that's happening and work with partners to overcome that together. It's not our role to be punitive and to add that secondary layer of contract management, as mentioned earlier. It's our role to facilitate the systems change and understand what's going on there. And we introduce a very clear governance structure that brings in partners from housing, health, justice, social care services, so that that ecosystem is at the centre of the governance for everything that we do. And rather than putting the ring fence around those 8 partners, as mentioned in the previous part of the presentation, our circle goes around the whole of Kirklees and the whole of West Yorkshire. So whenever we identify something that needs to change systemically, we can raise that information up and down so it influences on a wider commissioning structure. I think to pick up on the area around the limited flexibility, which was identified as a key challenge, under the previous contracts, there was a very rigid specification about how services were delivered with little or no opportunity for innovation, but we've created an environment of flexibility and innovation. Our single goal is, from the very first conversation with someone, is to understand what they want to achieve and how we get them there. And our outcomes mechanisms gives us the flexibility for partners to do that. They can respond to whatever a person says. We've stopped fixing, we've started listening and letting the person lead that support, and the contract allows us to do that. We do have a rate card, but this is an enabler, which means that we can focus on the person and not the targets. If we have understood what that person wants to achieve and we've enabled them to do that, our contract measurables will be met. It shouldn't be that one leads the other. And what we've tried to do around that is introduce various things to support that flexibility. So, for example, we've brought in a personalisation fund, which means we've got a pot of money that we can use to access any of the achievements somebody wants in any way that somebody might want to do it. So, for example, we had somebody recently who wanted to set up her own dog walking business. So we funded the insurance around the business, we funded her walking boots, we funded a collection of tools that she needed, and she's gone off and set up her own business. Whereas under previous contract requirements, that never would have been an option, and it would have been focusing on housing or CV writing or training. So again, it's about the person leading whatever they want to achieve and us giving them the freedom to do that. And then I think that links in with the final point around limited collaboration that was raised as an issue before. We have become one network. We are an alliance, we are a partnership. There may be 8 individual organisations within Kbop, but Kbop is a sum of our parts. We act as a partnership, offering guidance and support and expertise to each other. And we as Kbop, in terms of the contract management process, have created that space for relationships, for trust, for information sharing. And our partners, I hope, consider themselves as one rather than those individual organisations. And again, an example within that would be that each partner is able to share unique knowledge and experience very willingly with other people. And we've developed different opportunities to facilitate that. So we've set up reflective practice sessions, we've set up skill swap sessions, employment forums, management action learning sets, shared training, and all of those different opportunities are facilitated by each of the partners. It's not necessarily us to lead all of that. So I think just to pick up on your next element of the question and how the changes to the contract have been and what the different enablers have been around that, I think the biggest areas of the changes as referenced above is the implementation of the contract management process, the quality standardisation, removing unnecessary process, introducing that strengths-based approach to delivery, and how we can shift and give control back to those individuals that are delivering the partnership and those organisations. And I think within that, we can see that that's working, because rather than working with the same group of individuals the whole time, we've now worked with 2,419 people and achieved over 1,500 outcomes so far, which is a fundamental shift in terms of how things were working previously.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Really helpful reflections there around added flexibility, the asset-based model you're using, and around shifting control and using new governance structures. Just to follow up on that, you've already begun to mention the various changes you're seeing as a result of this transition to the outcomes contract, but are there ways of perhaps separating the technical aspects from the relational aspects of this?
In my personal opinion, I don't think there is. I think fundamentally the outcomes contracts give you a model and a tool for delivering these services, but within that, these contracts are built on trust and relationships. Cross-sector collaboration is only possible through conversations, information sharing, partnerships, and those solution-focused discussions. When we identify a systemic barrier, we can't overcome this in isolation. It has to be done through all those different organisations and bodies across the whole of Kirklees. So although there are the technical aspects that are the enablers, it's the relational aspects that mean that things can actually happen on a delivery basis. And an operational example of this would be our prison leavers pathway. So we identified that individuals were coming out of custody and required to go through multiple processes, through the multiple organisational requirements, through justice, housing, and the prisons. And we brought everybody together to identify this issue is in place. We use existing systems and processes. we brought the entire process back 10 weeks and we changed the paperwork behind it. So although the duty to refer form was still completed, it was done earlier, it was done in collaboration, it was shared across all the different individual organisations working with the person, preventing that multi-layered approach, and meaning that individual was at the centre of what was going on and had accommodation on release because of that shared information process.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to pause and look through the chat for some questions, and I see that we have one from Lisa Sparks. So Lisa, wondering if you want to unmute and ask your question yourself, otherwise I'm happy to do so.
No, it's fine. I'm happy to ask. I was just wondering how you've guarded against perverse incentives such as cherry picking the easier clients to make sure, because I mean, obviously, I think most of us are seeing people with higher levels of complexity. How are you ensuring that, you know, people are receiving the service equally, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that was one of the things that I was most frustrated about when we came into delivery in Kirklees, that there was different categorizations of individuals' needs, whether you were low, medium, high, complex. And as far as we're concerned, it's irrelevant. If somebody has an area of need, it is up to us to support that individual irrespective of what's happened previously. And what we did to ensure that that cherry picking wasn't taking place across different partners is we took that decision making process in centrally. So at Kbop, we receive the referral information that comes in for anybody wanting to use the service. We carry out the initial assessment with someone to understand their needs and their ambitions. We then allocate to the individual partners that we're working with. So we remove that opportunity for somebody to think that somebody might be too complex or too hard to engage. And then as part of our quality and audit process, we are constantly reviewing files, conversations, language use. So if somebody tries to remove support, saying that an individual is too hard to engage, we will put that back on the service saying, well, what have you done to adapt your response to meet the needs of the individual? How have you changed your engagement process to find a way to engage with that individual? It's not necessarily up to them to engage with you, it's up to you to find a way to open and to build that relationship with them.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Lisa and Sarah. Francisca, I was wondering if you wanted to come in with any reflections at this point.
Yes, sure. So I think I just want to pick up on what Sarah just mentioned around the relational dimension. I think that's very important because, yeah, in which ways does an outcomes-based contract helps to overcome service fragmentation? So yeah, all outcomes-based contracts do have this inherent features that all providers are accountable collectively for the outcomes, but then I think what is really interesting to compare how the governance of these different social impact bonds is set up. So is it very much a strong system orchestrator who is able to build these relationships, who's actually the key ingredient or one of the key ingredients in overcoming service fragmentation? So I guess that's on our research agenda as well.
Thanks very much, Francisca. Great. So I'm wondering if I can come to you next, Richard. You, of course, have a wealth of experience in outcomes-based contracting around the world in a range of socioeconomic contexts. Do you have any reflections on the applicability of outcomes-based contracting across lower income contexts, which often also come with low capacity?
Sure, Tanya, thank you. Yeah, people often assume that some form of performance-based contract is simply not going to be appropriate or applicable in a low income or a fragile context. And actually, it's my experience that they are even more so. They're even more relevant. They're more important in these environments. These contexts are typically characterized by constant change. There is often a risk that money doesn't actually get to what it's supposed to be buying. It doesn't get where it's intended. And the systems themselves are often very dysfunctional and siloized, often exacerbated by the behavior of the donors, who have their own agendas, and they sit in London or DC or Geneva, and they decide what the solution is, and that's what will be imposed upon the country, without any collaboration with anyone else. If you attach the money to the performance, you start to address a lot of these. Now you have to think about making sure that the contract works, you've got the right payment model, and you've got strong performance management in place. But attaching the money to the performance can go a long way to address all of these issues and provide the service with the flexibility that it needs to address this constant change. So I'll give you a couple of examples, and I'm going to talk, I talk about performance-based contracts here rather than purely outcome-based. I think in some instances, we can talk very cleanly and clearly about an outcome, such as an employment program. The outcome is a job, a sustained job. When I start to look at contracting health services, I think I need to start looking at the performance in terms of certain outputs, because the outcome or the impact becomes too hard to measure and too hard to make it relevant to actually the service that is being delivered. I've spent a number of years working in Afghanistan until this summer. And one of the things that I worked on was the contracting of basic and essential health services. So when the Taliban took over, when the Taliban were kicked out rather in 2001, there were no health services in the country. And the global community went in, and in order to stand stuff up very rapidly, they contracted it out. They contracted out this basic and essential health provision, initially to international NGOs, and then over the years, that moved from international to local NGOs, who'd been built in terms of their capacity by those international organizations. And the health services did pretty well. In global comparative terms, their performance was not bad. But it stagnated and it reached a certain level of performance and then stopped. So 3 years ago, we looked at how to move these contracts, which were budget reimbursement. The NGOs put forward their budget for the coming 3 years, and that's what they were reimbursed on a quarterly basis. We shifted it to an activity-based or a performance-based contract, where we defined 11 key health interventions, and there was a unit price for each one of those, and the more of them they did, the more they got paid. So immunization was one of them. Managed cesarean sections was another one. The more of them they did, the more they got paid. And performance shot up like this. Now, pre this summer, so over the last few years, the Taliban have controlled roughly a third of Afghanistan, the government roughly a third, and a third has moved backwards and forwards between the Taliban and the government. In those areas where the Taliban controlled and the NGOs had budget reimbursement contracts, the health services would often simply be closed down. And there was no incentive for the NGO to open that service and to deliver it because the Taliban didn't like it, they didn't like this government intervention, they weren't going to let it happen, and the NGO was going to get their budget reimbursed anyway. Once we started paying for contracts on the basis of performance, the NGOs then had an incentive to go and negotiate with the Taliban. And these health facilities started to open again. So the NGOs were incentivized to go and look at this, call it an ecosystem if you like, call it an infrastructure if you like, but the wider environment, and try to make it work for them in order to deliver the health interventions. They changed the opening hours of their clinics. They started to place community health workers in remote locations. They started to pay for taxis to get women to the hospital for the managed cesarean section. They started to pull all of the disparate strands together in order to focus on the performance. Now, a couple of things we got wrong in this in Afghanistan was, one, we didn't take into account that if we're going to pay them for performance, they need to be able to invest some money ahead of that performance in order to enable it to happen. Where was that working capital going to come from? The NGOs didn't have it themselves. There was no funding facility for them. There was no social investment brought in to provide that upfront working cost. That was the first thing. The second thing was, whilst we built a performance management unit in the Ministry of Public Health, its capacity remained relatively limited. For these systems to work, for performance to be maximized in your system, you need to have strong performance management within the system. Now, impact bonds are often viewed as very complex, difficult, structured things. They're not really that difficult. An impact bond is saying, I want to pay for the outcomes, but I need some working capital to get me to those outcomes, to get the system working initially. I'll bring in social investment to cover that working capital. Oh, and that social investment will follow its investment to protect it with strong performance management. So I strengthen the governance within my system, both in terms of the quantity and the quality of it. One further quick example, in Nigeria, we're looking at the testing and treatment undertaken by PPMVs, and I can never remember what PPMV stands for, but it's basically a one-person pharmacist who operates in a rural or semi-urban area on an informal basis, selling drugs, selling treatments to the population. They operate outside of the system, and they want to try and bring them back into the system to increase the testing and treatment that they do of malaria, which is a big killer in Nigeria, increase their testing and treatment and the reporting of that testing and treatment. Now, typically, DC, London, or Geneva would sit back and go, oh, we need to deliver a training program, or we need to change the legislation in the country, or we need to do a whole bunch of different single disconnected interventions, none of which actually change the behavior of the PPMVs. So what we're doing now is helping the National Malaria Elimination Program to contract with a facilitator. This facilitator acts as a sort of intermediary. They have a performance-based contract. Initially, they're paid to give them some working capital, to engage with PPMVs and to provide them with some training and accredit them, and give them a sandwich board and some advertising material. Then the facilitator is paid for 12 months on the basis of the number of reported tests and treatments that meet certain minimum standards that the PPMVs do. Do they do these tests and treatments, and do they report them? If they do, then the facilitator is paid. The PPMV is not subsidized in any way. We're looking to develop this as a sustainable business model for them. The facilitator has also got to ensure that the supplies are being brought into the area so they've got access to the drugs that are required. The facilitator acts as this, in this orchestrator way that AlNur describes. Different contexts, different sort of contracts, different services. But I think when you start to look at the performance on the front line, you see how this ecosystem, or call it what you will, can be drawn together in order to focus on the delivery of that frontline performance. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Risha, particularly for those really illustrative examples from Afghanistan and Nigeria. I'm wondering if this is a good time to bring you back in, Professor AlNur, and particularly your work around ecosystem orchestrators. So how do you think ecosystem orchestrators can help build some of these cross-sector collaborations that we've been talking about, particularly when it comes to addressing multiple complex needs? And also, how do you know a good ecosystem orchestrator when you see one? You already spoke about Miriam's Kitchen, but are there any other examples that you could perhaps add to that?
Well, certainly, I think we're seeing the biggest challenge of it right now with the lead up to the climate summit in Glasgow. If there were ever an ecosystem problem, both in terms of the physical ecosystem as well as the organizational one, that's it, right? I mean, that's the highest stakes one that we have. And we're seeing real challenges around commitments by organizations, governments in this instance, and in order to rally around sort of a common cause. So here we see sort of the outcome that we're looking for is there's very little ambiguity around that. Right? Whether it's 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase or 2 or 3, is a matter of debate, but that's the metric and it's not hard to measure. How do we know whether we have an ecosystem orchestrator when we see one? I think it really has to do with that capacity of that entity, or perhaps it's multiple entities, to enable that collective conversation and then to advocate collectively for it. Part of the reason that I studied homelessness for this was because one could actually wrap your arms around the problem and the number of players. And there too, though, I found that there wasn't just one orchestrator, there were multiple orchestrators. So Miriam's Kitchen partnered with 5 or 6 other organizations at a community level, and then they found that there were all of these others at the national level, and they built these partnerships. So you have these multiple orchestrators, these multiple backbones. I think it's unusual to have a single orchestrator. I think that's probably more feasible where there's a major source of funding, so say some sort of government commissioning to an entity like Kbop that then is able to do this work. But I think that's more the exception rather than the rule. So in a sense, I think perhaps a big potential research project for me, as well as for folks at the Go Lab and others, is to ask, so what are different models of system orchestrators that we might be able to identify? And what are the funding mechanisms that might work for different examples of these. And impact bonds are really just one mechanism that work in a very limited set of contexts. But I'd love to hear from others on this. I'd love to hear from Val on this in terms of what they're seeing at a governmental level.
Thank you so much, Eldon. That's actually a great segue because I was going to come to Val next. So, Val, for the last part of the discussion, it would be great to bring you in and particularly unpick some of the more practical considerations, for both policymakers and practitioners. You, of course, have a lot of experience working both in central government as well as the voluntary sector around multiple and complex needs. So, to begin with, what do you see as the primary challenges when it comes to coordinating support for adults with multiple and complex needs?
Thanks, Tanya. I think having worked on the front line and worked in central government and various places in between, just what comes through very strongly is just the distance between the person receiving the service, the people that Sarah's talking about who Kbop are trying to work alongside and be led by what it is they're trying to achieve, and then the people at the top of institutions that need to make decisions about what the policy priorities are, how best to spend money, whether that be public money, taxpayers' money, or other resources, and need to organise the accountability arrangements for that. So it's actually really hard to, when you have those two starting points as really important imperatives, and both sides of that are very important, but trying to kind of make the chain between the two in a way that you can have appropriate leadership and accountability, and you can organise services in a logical way at the same time as having services that work for individuals who have multiple needs. There's the challenge. I guess that's not a surprise to anyone. And I think that the way that we organise services in the sense of particular issues focus and being organised along the lines of different functions, it works very well for lots of services and for lots of people. But I'm sure a lot of us can identify from personal experience or from people that we know that once more than a couple of big things go wrong in life, then they stop being isolated problems and the problem becomes coping with life generally. And that's the moment when you have a lot of different things going on and lots of different service needs, or contact with services that you don't want or need. So, criminal justice organisations spring to mind as part of that. But, there are a range of different interactions with services, some of which you're seeking out and some of which you're not. Then the services can become part of the problem, or the way some of them interact together and provide services can become part of the problem. So I think that's the key challenge, really. So for people who are facing multiple disadvantage, you kind of have to one of the challenges I think for us in the Changing Futures programme is to bring that closer together. So one of the underpinning principles for the programme is to have people with lived experience and multiple disadvantage at the core of it all the way through, and all of the partners, all of the different government departments who are part of the programme come together, and part of those meetings will be conversations with people with lived experience. There'll be conversations with people in local areas who are trying to make these systems work and are trying to join things up and are trying to identify what the challenges are and what the levers are to make different things better. So I guess part of what we're trying to do is narrow that gap effectively.
Thanks so much, Val. You've already started talking about this a little bit, but overall, how do you see the role of central government in facilitating some of this more joined up working, and what are the sort of challenges and facilitators that you see there in more sort of practical terms?
Yeah, so there are a lot of examples around at the minute where bits of the UK government are trying to do this, and it's really interesting to kind of watch it. And, you know, some of them are like major systems change pieces of work on a macro scale. So thinking about joining up health and social care, the whole integration agenda there, that's, you know, that's work that's kind of well underway and continues to happen. But there are also smaller kind of test and learn pieces of work that are happening. Some people on the call might be aware of something that Treasury set up a couple of years ago called the Shared Outcomes Fund. And the specific goal of the Shared Outcomes Fund is basically to bring together different bits of the public sector to deliver better outcomes in situations where one department or one service can't deliver those outcomes. So there are a whole range of things there that are basically doing bringing people together to kind of test different approaches and to build learning and to help central government understand which are the things that need to change at the centre and which of the things can be supported locally. And I think there are definitely two strands to what can be done at the centre. One is what can we stop doing? What can we do less of? What can government do less of? That kind of, you know, the things that get in the way, the things that make it extra hard for local collaboration to happen, as well as what are the positive things that need to be done in terms of resourcing and the way policy and legislation and regulation changes. So I think there is a need for a kind of a humility at the centre, I think, and some really honest conversations across government and bringing the different sectors together, both locally and nationally, and getting those intersections to work to build the understanding around a common goal and the sorts of things that are getting in the way of achieving those common goals.
Thank you so much, Val. Before we move to pretty much the last part of the session, which is the sort of closing remarks, could I come back to you, Richard, very quickly? So the need for a coordinator that, for instance, Val spoke about, is that something that's only needed in the UK or a high income context, or is that something you also see space for in more lower income countries?
Thanks, Tanya. I think it's desperately needed in lower income countries where I actually see greater fragmentation, as I say, often driven by the behavior of the donors. And as I go into a conversation in an environment like that, and you find around the table there are people with such disparate agendas, wanting different things, seeing the world in different ways, wanting their own personal cut of it in some sort of way, possibly analogous to a whole bunch of UK government departments all trying to come together. And the only way that we can drive that collaboration from the beginning and then all the way through is try to define and agree together a set of really quite simple, clear, measurable outcomes ultimately for the service users, for the citizens. And they've got to be measurable, they've got to be clear, we've got to be able to count them. I want to be able to attach some money to them because I want to commission them and have them delivered. But I start with that definition, essentially, of what does success look like for this citizen in this context? And then I keep bringing everyone back to that question. Is this the success that we've been talking about? And I drive that right through the process of service design, contract design, commissioning, performance management. What is that success?
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to come to everyone, all of our speakers one by one, again in alphabetical order, just for one key takeaway from today's session that you want to leave us with. And then I'm going to come to Elle, so that you can sum up some of our main conclusions from today. So starting with you, Professor AlNur, then Richard, Sarah, and Val Keane, just one quick takeaway from today.
I'm gonna raise actually a challenge that we face rather than a takeaway, and that is that we tend to measure success by trying to attribute it to the work of single organizations. And funders also want to see that. They want to take credit for the work that they're funding. Whereas what we've been talking about today, you can't attribute success to any single intervention or any single organization. And so if funding is connected to that, we have a problem. And so we've got fragmentation that is enhanced or exacerbated by that focus on attribution. So we need new ways of thinking about this, whether it's some sense of collective contribution that then moves the needle on a problem, but we can't attribute to single organizations. That piece of it, in terms of how we assess success, also needs to shift if we're going to enable this kind of system orchestration.
There used to be a lot of talk about centering things around places. localizing services to a place. And AlNur made the point earlier that we need to center things around people. You need to center things around individuals. And if you center them around the individuals, then you drive true collaboration. That's it from me.
I think for me, it's that these contracts enable social change. We've got the opportunity for the innovation through their flexibility, through our accountability to the people that we're working alongside, and they have value proposition. We cannot end homelessness or have meaningful systems change by working in isolation, and we've got to listen and we've got to collaborate.
And finally, for me, I think the just evaluation of the system impacts is a real challenge for government. So government's really happy with evaluating with interventions, and Elle elaborated quite nicely on the challenges around evaluating the SIB mechanism, changing features. We're trying to take a systems approach to this and developing the evaluation approaches and working with people at the centre of government to thinking about evaluation practice is a key element of this, I think, going forward.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those reflections and for that challenge, Professor AlNur. And to help us summarize some of those insights, could I come to you, Elle? In particular, any considerations for policymakers and practitioners who are hoping to address service fragmentation?
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I mean, it's certainly challenging to pull it all together because it's been such a bubbly conversation. So thank you. I'll have a go at pulling out a couple of themes. I think we've really been reflecting on outcomes contracting as a potential model for funding and catalyzing this work of system coordination or ecosystem coordination, orchestration. And I think this seeing interdependence is an important theme here. So this isn't just across a named set of provider organisations in a contract, but thinking up and out to a wider constellation of actors. And I was really struck by the work that Sarah described around the prison leavers pathway. There's no hard contractual relationship there, but a more purposeful conversation about how the system needs to be reshaped and reformed to improve outcomes. The other thing I noted was this item around listening and person-centeredness. This calls on a different set of skills and practices. So this certainly changes the nature of frontline practice, but we're also needing to think about different sets of skills for doing this work of coordination. And I think AlNur had some helpful tips for things to think about in terms of advocacy, organising, agitating and coming together. I think that's an important set of skills. We need to think about who's playing those roles and who's funding those roles. And the final theme I wanted to touch on is humility, because I think the conversation here is really one of learning and an acknowledgement that there might be tensions here. There's certainly not obvious, it's certainly not an obvious partnership, payment by results and a collective impact need. So we need to think and be open about those tensions, I think. Acknowledging that an outcomes contract may not always be appropriate, may be appropriate for one very small portion of this wider landscape of work. But I also think it really throws down the gauntlet for researchers, because if we want to be responsive to the challenge here, the challenge of fragmentation, then we need to think quite hard about what are the different governance models that are available to us here, who are the partners, what roles do they need to play, and are we doing a good job of bringing those together and describing that to give tips and support to people who are really trying to make the change happen. So I think that's a very brief summary for me, but a really big thanks to everyone for such a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ab, for such a comprehensive summary. It's definitely not an easy task. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today, to all our speakers, to our participants for such a rich discussion. Also in the chat, I saw a lot of questions being answered there, so we can never bring them into the session, but wonderful that they were answered nevertheless. And again, for such lovely, really insightful examples, lots around interdependence, around listening and around person-centeredness. We will be back in a few weeks with another Engaging with Evidence session, as Laura mentioned. This time we'll be focusing on cross-sector collaborations aimed at supporting refugees. This one's particularly close to my heart, so I'm really excited for this session. We'll be sharing the date and time for this session very soon, so do watch this space and do follow or subscribe to our newsletter. In the meantime, have a great rest of the week and see you very soon.